our practice. Dr. Pankaj Kundra is a professor in the Department of Anaesthesiology and Critical Care at JIPMER, Pondicherry, where he also serves as a dean in charge of the School of Medicine. With a career marked by excellence in clinical care, education, and research, he has been honored with the ISA National Lifetime Achievement Award in 2015. He's held prestigious leadership roles, including serving as a past president of IDA National. A prolific speaker, he has delivered 12 major orations nationally and internationally. He has authored 149 publications in peer-reviewed journals, contributing significantly to the advancement of anesthesia and critical care medicine in India. Time to dive into physics with clinical relevance as we understand how gas laws translate into our ORs. Please welcome Dr. Pankaj Kundra.
A very good morning to all of you. Thank you for being here early in the morning to listen to us. This is probably the session for the postgraduates to look at the gas laws. Nevertheless, I hope I'm able to deliver what is required. Now let's start to understand what is a gas. If you want to understand what is a gas, you need to know what's the critical pressure. So the critical temperature would be the temperature above which gas cannot be liquefied no matter how high the pressure is. So remember, at the pressure, if the gas is at a higher than the critical pressure, you cannot liquefy no matter what pressure you apply. And so it implies that the substance is always in a gaseous phase when it is above the critical pressure, and the substance is in a gaseous phase when it is below its critical pressure, that's a vapor. So let's have a proper illustration of this. If you look at this, this is probably the critical temperature of this particular gas, which is at 50 degrees. And if I apply a pressure of 100 psi, and if this is a gas, it will not liquefy, because the temperature is above 50 degrees. If I apply 500 psi pressure, it still does not liquefy. So no matter whatever pressure I apply, because the gas is at above the critical temperature, it does not liquefy. However, if the temperature is 49.9 degrees centigrade, it is less than the critical pressure, then if I give a 100 psi pressure, it will liquefy, and that is the characteristic of a vapor. So this is what we need to understand, what is a vapor and what is a gas and what is a critical pressure. Now let's try to see the interrelationship between gas, liquid and vapor, which I have already represented earlier. So at 40 degrees centigrade, pressure applied of 50 psi, the substance liquefies. At 50 degrees centigrade, if I still apply 50 psi pressure, the substance liquefies. But at 50.1 degrees centigrade, pressure of psi, whatever I apply, the gas does not liquefy. So the critical temperature here would be about 50 degrees centigrade. Now we have talked about pressure so much, there has to be a relationship and units of how the pressures are represented. So this is a pressure gauge, and pressure is generally given by the formula of force upon area. So the units of the pressure are 1 bar is equal to 1 atmosphere, which is equal to 760 millimeters of mercury, which is equal to 100 kPa, and 1 bar will be equal to 14.7 psi. So this dial pressure gauge represents bar and PCI. So how do we understand what's the relation between bars and PCI? So if you apply 200 bar of pressure, then it will be a product with 14.7, and you'll get a pressure of PCI of 2,940. So that is how bars are converted into PCI. Now let's see how kPa is related to the PSI. Now for kPa, you will have to divide 100 by the PSI unit of 14.7. So if 1 psi is equal to 100 divided by 14.7, 1 psi will equal 6.8 kPas. And if it is 3 psi, it will be a product into 3, and it will be 20 kPa, and that is what the dial represents here. So these pressure units are important. You You go to a place where you want to fill up your rear tire of your car or a bike, you need 36 psi, but if the pressure gauge tells you it is in kPa, you should be immediately able to know what's the kPa pressures you will require. It will be about 1.8 kPa in that sense. The other important aspect is to know the relationship between temperatures, the centigrades, the Fahrenheits, and the absolute Kelvin. So 0 degrees equals to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, which is equal to 273 degrees absolute temperature. Now let's come to the Boyle's law. Having understood these basic principles, what are the pressure units and what are the critical temperatures? So as you all know, that Boyle's law for a fixed mass of gas at constant temperature relates that the pressure is inversely proportional to the volume. That means as the pressure rises, the volume of the gas decreases. So this is on the x-axis. So you'll see that the volume of the gas will decrease as the pressure will rise, which means the pressure will compress the gas. As you look at your LPG cylinders which come home, it is a liquefied gas. So it is compressed to a smaller volume because there is a higher pressure in those cylinders. So if the gas is compressed, it has less space to be in, and so it is pushed harder against the walls of the container. That is what the Boyle's law tells us. What's the application? So what we need to understand is that if we have an E-type cylinder with us by the side on the anesthesia machine, and the gas is compressed, the oxygen is compressed into it to a smaller volume, but when it comes out into the flow meter, what will be the volume of oxygen when it is uncompressed? So the application of Boyle's law is simple here. The pressure inside the E-type cylinder is about 22,000 psi, and the gas is compressed to 5 liters. So this is a compressed gas. Now if we want to know what will be the volume of the gas or oxygen when it is released into the atmosphere, or when it is uncompressed, or when it is delivered through the flow meters, then the pressures here would be converted into the atmosphere, because it is coming to the atmospheric pressure now, which is 760, and we want to know the gas volume. So the equation can be just supplemented, and you will find that the total volume of the gas when it is uncompressed, or oxygen when it is uncompressed, at about 665 liters. So you can see that 665 liters is compressed to 5 liters in this cylinder. So you have a small volume but at a higher pressure, so you can have a larger amount of oxygen whenever you need to use it for a long period of time. So if you use oxygen at 3 liters per minute, it will last you for about 221 minutes. So that's the way you see how is the volume being utilized, what time you have if the central oxygen pipeline fails. Let's come to the Charles law. So for Charles' law, it's a fixed mass of gas at constant pressure, and the volume is directly proportional to the temperature, which means that if I heat up the gas here, increase the temperature, the pressure is constant, so the volume of the gas will also increase. That's what is Charles' law. It means the gas tends to expand when heated. And if you look at the equation, volume is directly proportional to the temperature. So if the temperature increases, the volume also increases. So how do we apply it to our anesthetic practice? We want to know what's the volume of nitrous oxide in E-type cylinders. Because all of you know nitrous is dispensed in the cylinders in a liquid form, and when it vaporizes, then it is converted into a gaseous form which is delivered through the flow meters. So the critical temperature of nitrous oxide is about 36.5 degrees centigrade, and nitrous oxide is liquid at room temperature, which is at 20 degrees. So the Boyle's law is not applicable, and pressure gauge does not depict the volume of the gas. So to calculate the volume of nitrous oxide in the cylinder, you either weigh the tare weight of the full cylinder and the empty cylinder, and then you will get the weight of the nitrous oxide. But otherwise, if you want to actually know what is the amount of nitrous present, then you will have to apply the Avogadro's hypothesis, which means 1 molecular weight of nitrous oxide will occupy 22.4 liters. So if the molecular weight of nitrous oxide is 44 grams, then 44 grams of nitrous oxide will occupy 2.1 liters, and 333, this is the weight of the cylinder, so 300 grams of nitrous oxide will occupy, will give you about 1680 liters. So that is the volume of gas present in a nitrous oxide cylinder. So the Boyle's law is good for gases like oxygen, but Avogadro's hypothesis is used to calculate the volume of nitrous oxide in nitrous cylinders because it is liquid at room temperature. So what will be the volume of nitrous oxide in E-type cylinder at room temperature when it comes out? So this is the equation where volume is divided by temperature, which is equal to a constant. So if you look at the temperature, it is represented here in kelvins, right? So the room temperature would be 273 plus 20, which is 293 kelvins. So if you put all the numbers there, you will find that the total volume of nitrous oxide, which is now present, would be 1803 liters as compared to when it is in the cylinder, which is 1680 liters. So when it comes out into the atmosphere, it is about 200 liters more than what it is there, because you cannot compress it more than that, it liquefies. So more important is not to know the pressure, it's more important to apply the Avogadro's hypothesis to know what is the volume of nitrous oxide available. So injection vaporizers also applies the Avogadro's hypothesis. So why do we need these injection vaporizers? That's the question, which means we are directly injecting a liquid into the breathing circuit which goes into the lungs of the patient. So if you want to deliver 2% of end-tidal concentration of sevoflurane, which means that the sevoflurane concentration in the lungs, in the circuit, is 2%, and the patient is in a steady state, you will have to know what is the volume in which the sevoflurane has to be dispensed. So here it is about 6 liters. And you want to fill up 6 liters with 2% of sevoflurane so that it is constant. So what will you need to know? How much of that sevoflurane vapor would be produced? So in 6 liters, if you keep 2% inspired concentration, you will be producing 120 ml of sevoflurane. That's the amount of vapor which is required. Now, my targets in the modern anesthesia machine is that I want to maintain a steady state or an end tidal of 2%, which will completely keep the patient anesthetized. But I want to use oxygen, which is just the oxygen consumption of the body, which is 180 ml. I don't want to use 6 liters or 4 liters of oxygen flow or the fresh gas flow. My fresh gas flow should be just 180 liters. And I should be able to achieve this sevoflurane concentration within 1 minute. Normally, with 6 liters, if you want to get a steady state of 2%, you will require 10 to 15 minutes with 6 liters. So imagine with 180 ml, can I receive it in 1 minute? You can. If you supplement this here, this is 120 ml of sevoflurane which is required, which will be suspended into 180 ml of oxygen. So you will require about 40% of sevoflurane to be delivered. So if you can deliver 40% of sevoflurane into the circuit, you can achieve an anesthetic depth in 1 minute with just 200 to 180 ml of fresh gas flow, rather than keeping a fresh gas flow of 6 liters or 8 liters or so. So your Aladdin vaporizers have a maximum output of 8%. That's why the injection vaporizers can achieve these targets. You can prevent the wastage and contamination of the operating theaters and use very low flows, just the metabolic flow rates, to make sure you achieve anesthetic depth within 1 minute with higher concentrations which are given. So how much of vapor, how do you know how much of vapor 1 ml of sevoflurane produces? So again, you'll have to know the molecular weight and specific gravity, and if you apply the Avogadro's hypothesis, it is that 18.5 moles of isoflurane at 22.4 liters at standard temperature and pressure will produce 1 gram will produce how much? It will produce 194 ml of vapor. So that's how the vapor is taken into account as how the liquid is vaporized, and you should know how much of vapor is suspending in how much of volume to actually calculate the concentrations. Now let's come to the third part of Gay-Lussac's law. The Gay-Lussac's law tells you that when for a fixed gas at constant volume, the pressure is directly proportional to the temperature. So pressure is directly proportional to the temperature, so if you divide it, there has to be a constant. So in Gay-Lussac's law, volume is constant, right? That's the constant we are talking about. In Charles' law, pressure is constant. In Boyle's law, temperature is constant. So what's the implication? So here is what happens. The pressure is applied here. There's a constant volume, temperature. Now if I heat the volume of this gas here, and the pressure is increased and the volume is not allowed to expand, right? The pressure will increase inside, but the volume of the gas will remain constant. What's the implication? The implication is that the volume is not allowed to expand, but the pressure is constantly increasing inside that space because of a high temperature. So there is an increase in pressure. So if I apply there, if you store oxygen cylinders in a cool place and into the sun, the temperature is maintained, the volume is the same, and the pressure is the same. But if you maintain or keep oxygen cylinders outside in the sun, the temperature increases, volume increases, pressure increases, and there is an increase of explosion risk. The molybdenum steel can withstand almost 210 bars of pressure, but if it increases more than that, there will be an explosion. Now let's come to the deriving the universal gas laws. So why do we need the universal gas laws, or what is an ideal gas law? So here 4 fundamental gas laws are combined into a single expression to yield the ideal gas law. What does it mean? This is Boyle's law, which is volume is indirectly proportional to pressure. And this is Charles' law, where volume is proportional to temperature, and Gay-Lussac tells pressure is proportional to temperature. So temperature is constant here, which should be going at the numerator. So this will be represented by all the 3 gas laws. So temperature, because it is constant here in both these equations, it goes and takes the numerator. P is as per the Boyle's law. And as per the Avogadro's law, which we have talked about, it says volume of a gas at constant pressure and temperature is proportional to the number of molecules that make up the gas. That means V is proportional to N. So if you have to put Avogadro's hypothesis into ideal gas law, in the numerator you will have to put N to get you the number of moles. And therefore, if you have a constant applied, if you want to convert proportion to an equation, then R is supposed to be the universal gas constant. So if we keep P and V, then the universal gas law will be number of moles into the constant and the temperature. So even 2 gases of the same volume at a constant temperature and pressure, then the 2 gases will have an identical number of moles. Right? So if the 2 gases are kept at an identical pressure and temperature, the volume or number of moles of both the 2 gases will remain the same. It's very important to understand that. So I'll just skip this. Let's go to the clinical application of this ideal gas law. You all have heard about NOx. Nitrous oxide is mixed with oxygen. Right? How does it decide that the same 50:50 concentration should be delivered to the patient? How does the NOx decide that? Now here's the universal gas law which comes into picture. The Poynting effect tells us that when 2 gases of high and low critical pressures are mixed in a container, the critical temperature of the gas with higher critical pressure, right, which is nitrous oxide here, will decrease to a lower level, and it will become a pseudo-critical pressure of the mixture, which will remain as a gas above the pseudo-critical temperature.
So what's the critical temperature for oxygen? It is minus 180 degrees. For nitrous oxide, it is 37 degrees. So which temperature will decrease? It is the nitrous oxide temperature which will fall, and you will have a pseudo-critical temperature of minus 6 degrees centigrade. Why minus? Because at this critical temperature, the mixture will remain as a gas with pseudo-critical temperature. So that is how it is mixed. And because the number of moles are equal, at this pseudo-critical temperature, 50% of nitrous oxide and 50% of oxygen is always delivered. This ratio doesn't remain changed. So the mixture of nitrous oxide and oxygen will remain constant at remain a gas at room temperature. That's the Poynting effect. But what happens if the temperature is less than minus 6 degrees centigrade? There will be no analgesia because the nitrous oxide will separate into liquid and patient will inhale only oxygen. And hypoxia can occur when oxygen is exhausted and patient will then inhale only nitrous oxide. So that's the importance, that it should be never less than minus 6 degrees centigrade. So the solution is, even if the temperature falls, please shake up the Internox cylinder thoroughly before it is used. Let's come to the Dalton's law. Dalton's law tells you that the total pressure of a gas mixture is the sum of the pressures of each of the gases. So when the partial pressures of nitrous oxide and oxygen, when they develop in a ratio of 67% and 33%, you'll find these are the partial pressures of both oxygen and nitrous oxide. And both of them will equal the atmospheric pressure. And that is why, because of the Dalton's law of the pressure, where the pressure has to equal to the atmospheric pressure. So if you look at the nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, water vapor in inhaled, alveolar and exhaled air, if you sum up everything, it will always come to 760 millimeters of mercury. What's the principle in the vaporizer? Remember, you are given a liquid which is vaporized, you set volume concentration, but the gas exerts its effect in partial pressures. So the dial setting is in percentage, but the anesthetic action which occurs is because of the partial pressure of the inhalational agent. So normally to calculate the partial pressure, it's the partial pressure upon the total pressure, volume percent, because it is percent, it is divided by 100. So if you want to know the partial pressure, this is the equation, and if it is 2.1% of sevoflurane that you are giving, the partial pressure of 2.1% of sevoflurane will be 15.96 millimeters of mercury. So normally we say MAC is the minimal alveolar concentration, right? But it should be pronounced as Pmac, because the minimal alveolar concentration, which is to be expressed in partial pressures, should be Pmac1. So that is how it should actually be expressed. Similarly for desflurane, the partial pressure would be about 40.56. Now what happens at the high altitude? At sea level, the barometric pressure is 760. At 10,000 feet, it is about 500. So if halogen exerts 1% partial pressure of 7.6, at 10,000, 2% will exert 10%. So despite twofold increase, the increase in volume pressure, the partial pressure increases only 1.3 times. So actually there is hardly any effect of halothane, whatever you set at the barometric pressure or at a higher altitude. Only the partial pressure will be increasing by 1.3 times the pressure which is there of the halothane. Now let's talk about the Joule-Thomson effect. What is the Joule-Thomson effect? Look at this animation a little more carefully. When I am compressing a gas, when the pressure is increased and when it is decompressed, so when there is a sudden compression or expansion occurs suddenly, then what happens is it is an adiabatic process where energy is not added. I'll finish in 1 minute. Where energy is not added and the changes can occur. So what will happen, why is it indicated in an oxygen cylinder? So when you open an oxygen cylinder rapidly, the oxygen flows through a narrow tube. There is an adiabatic process, tubing in the yoke assembly and the pressure regulator. So that there is a rapid compression in the narrow tubes produces a high temperature. So there is a spark and in the presence of oxygen, it can lead to an explosion. So that's why we do a cracking of the oxygen cylinder before you put up onto the yoke assembly to make sure such a high temperature is suddenly not built up, because the gas is suddenly decompressed from a very high pressure to a low pressure. Thank you very much for your kind listening. It was great talking to you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir, for a great informative talk, as usual, of Kundra sir. And discussion will be the end.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for unraveling the science behind the gases we use every day.
Our final speaker in this session is